Thank you, Julie. Let's see. Here we go. That's a perfect introduction. Thanks for letting me be here. As I said, that I'm humbled and I'm privileged to be in a room with the caliber of folks here. When Charlie called me, I'm not sure I was quite sure how I made the cut. But I do want to do three things today, and Julie set it up quite nicely. Number one, tell you a little bit about my job at Cirrus, my role there, and what we do. And then number two, I'm going to share a little bit about how we think of flight training and flight operation at Cirrus Aircraft. In fact, I'm pulling a short clip of video just recently. I was the host for the single pilot safety stand down for NBAA, and if you think about Cirrus through sort of a different lens, every single flight virtually in some ways is single pilot in a Cirrus Aircraft, whether it's in a Vision jet or an SR, and I'll cover that in just a moment. And then finally, as Julie alluded to, in perhaps a rather unvarnished and unfiltered way, you're going to see the third pillar of this notion of flight safety and flight operations, the way we think of it at Cirrus. I want to share with you an experience that I suspect many in the room already know about from about 3.5 years ago, but I'll do it, like I said, in a rather unvarnished and personal and unfiltered way, and hopefully we can learn something from that. I know that so many people already have, and that's why I'm willing to stand up here and tell that story. Again, 15 years at Cirrus Aircraft. My title today is President of Customer Experience. I'm responsible for really all of the customer or outward-facing functions at Cirrus Aircraft: sales, marketing, service and support, flight training and operations, aircraft delivery. And my home is now in Knoxville, Tennessee, which is the home of the Vision Center. If you're aware of that at Cirrus, I've been at Cirrus coming up on 15 years, the first 8 of that in Duluth, Minnesota. And so while not native there, raised the family there, and I always sort of look at the temperature all the time. And then coming down to Knoxville to open the Vision Center, all aircraft deliveries are made there, and really what was the primary push was getting our full motion simulator there, the type rating program for the Vision jet. And I'll talk just a little bit about that. So as we go here, I think we're all very familiar, perhaps not, with the SR2X series, the high-performance single-engine piston. It's been the best-selling airplane in its segment, high-performance single-engine piston, for now 19 years in a row. Over 8,300 of these aircraft have been delivered, and some are surprised about just how much they're involved, not just in the retail part of aircraft usage, but even in flight training. I'll come to that in just a moment. The current is the Generation 6 airplane. And like many of us in the room that are in aviation right now, we're experiencing the updraft that's going on in just about all segments of personal aviation. As I like to say, I don't remember a time when personal aviation ever led the way out of a recession, and we can debate whether or not there was even a recession at all in COVID. I've lived through 2, going back to really 9/11, if you will, and then even 08, and that was a much more protracted thing. But this incredible push as people have given themselves permission to enter into aviation, and that's what they're doing today, certainly at Cirrus Aircraft. We're experiencing quite the updraft in sales and quite a very long backlog as well. I'll tell you one thing about Cirrus that we're very committed to, and it's safety and innovation in safety. And that's, of course, really, really hard, right? Anytime you change the airplane, you create risk. In fact, the basis of all we do here is based on repeatability. That's what our safety is built on. I'll do the same thing every time. As you like to say, if someone's making a decision, they might be doing something wrong because we want it to be consistent. Well, imagine when you're trying to innovate in the airplane, how challenging that can be to bring new technologies in the airplane, and it's not without risk. But Cirrus is committed to doing that, and they're committed to doing that in the SR and also the SF. I mentioned just a moment ago that we're involved in flight training in perhaps a broader way than is well understood. About 1,000 of our airplanes, mostly SR-20s, are active in flight training today. This is Marshall University. There's some of the recent ones. There are over 30 fleets or institutions or universities or agencies. This is Kansas State, recent. And then out in Goodyear, Lufthansa, really an adjunct of even EADS and Airbus, and the European Flight Training Center. And this is a pretty big one. It just changed hands. This has been the news quite a bit lately, that United, if you will, is solving their own problem. They're bringing even more SR-20s into what they call the United Aviate Academy, and they're adding on to that for flight training out there just outside of Phoenix. That's fantastic. Our airplane is actually quite preferred in the airline training environment, whether that's Emirates, Lufthansa, now United. There's many things about the plane. So we're actually pretty involved in flight training in a pretty broad way. I mentioned just a moment ago the SF-50, the Vision Jet. As we like to say, there's about 300 and some odd of those out in the wild. I brought one down here for the trip last night, and this airplane has just been a market mover and shaken up things. At Cirrus, we like to say that if we're going to go design and bring a new product to the market, it's going to be at least 20% better, depending on that criteria, than anything else out there, and this airplane checks that box. Of course, this is the airplane with auto land. We call it safe return. With the push of a button, the plane will land itself and bring it safely to a stop on a runway without any other human intervention. Every airplane we've ever delivered, SR and SF, comes standard with CAPS, the Cirrus airframe parachute system. To put those two things in context, if the airplane brakes, pull CAPS. If the pilot brakes, push that button. And so we have a system that are married to each other, and that's the way it works in the Vision Jet. It's been the best-selling turbojet aircraft now for 2 years in a row, and I think that will continue. We're not quite delivering 100 a year, but think about that number for just a second. Demand's quite strong for this. I will share with you that about 76%, 75%, let's call it, of people coming into the Vision Jet in this early stage are actually coming out of the SR. That's actually my story. About 500 and some odd hours in the Vision Jet. My time was in high performance single engine piston, primarily the SR. I'll talk a little bit about my flying in a bit. But that number is actually beginning to come down some. You expect that early on. You have a long development program. We had a little bit, I mentioned 08, 09, 010, that slowed a little bit, and it picked back up. So up to 3/4 are coming into this airplane from the SR. A lot of pictures there of what we're doing with that. The G2 Plus was just announced. That's performance at hot and high for all the jet pilots in the room. You know about hot, you know about high density altitude, all of those things and how that perfects jet performance. We actually enhanced the engine. It's been a real winner with G2 Plus, and even things like making this airplane work for our customers. Wi-Fi is now on board the airplane. We are seeing a usage pattern that's now beginning to move beyond simply owner-flown and into the non-owner-flown environment. If I can move to flight training and talk about the oversight that I have, but really the team that I'm a part of in flight training, over 60 professionals are based there in Knoxville, Tennessee, that in the flight operations and flight training department. Our vice president and our chief pilot is Rob Haig under his oversight. The full motion simulator for the Vision Jet gets a little bit of the airtime, but really we're talking about the program for all SR and SF. 600 flight training events, closer to 700 SR flight training events in just the last year through that team. A total now of 630 Vision Jet type ratings through that team. We also have a program that I'll get to in just a moment, both Cirrus Approach and something that we call Embark. In fact, Cirrus Approach is really the learning management system and all the materials that we put together for learning. And then this program we call Embark, that's when a Cirrus is secondhand or pre-owned or used in the market, but new to that owner. Cirrus, at no charge to that new owner, will provide transition training. We now have over 3,000 Embark events that have happened since the onset of that program just about 4 years ago, and we're quite proud of that. Sure. And we're going to continue that, and we're going to grow it. It's the right thing to do to continue to train the transition training, and of course it can be specialized a little bit, whether it's the Avidyne cockpit, the Garmin cockpit, or some of the things in the airplane unique to certain airplanes. And then I mentioned just Cirrus Approach. Let me show a couple of short video here about the way that we think about materials and the kind of learning materials in the contemporary environment. I think someone may have mentioned it earlier in one of the side conversations. We want engagement. We want to think of learning at Cirrus. In fact, we have this written on a wall. Learning is not an event, it's a lifetime commitment. Flight training is not one event, it's not passing a test, it's not doing the 6158 ride. It is a lifetime commitment, a lifestyle to the notion of flight training. And we try to make materials to match that. Here's a quick example. So some of those courses that we have are a takeoff and landings course. There is a CAPS course. You're going to hear me talk about this in just a minute in the second video I'm going to play. There's actually a new maneuvers course with a friend of Cirrus and partner Mike Goulian. And we're rolling those out into the network as we gradually fill out the entire library of these kinds of materials. And as I said a moment ago, all of those materials are also in the Embark program, so they are accessible to everyone and apply really to every airplane we've ever made. If I can, let me switch to that second part I mentioned, and that is, how do we think about flight training and flight operations at Cirrus? And I had the privilege of being invited to keynote or give the single pilot safety stand down at the most recent NBAA. I misspoke, the one right before the one in Las Vegas. So it's not even quite as old as the date here. It got moved back because of COVID. As I said, almost every flight a Cirrus makes is by definition single pilot operated. And I wanted to give you a sense of the three pillars that we sort of build our program on. You're going to see them in just a moment. And of course, we're going to close, and Julie's already given you a hint about the notion of culture within our flight operations. If you get within the community, well, there's a culture even within the community in this room and a culture within the community that we all teach in. I'm going to talk about that, and we're going to talk about the power of shared experience. And so if I can, let me play this about 5-minute clip that focuses specifically on these three pillars that we're talking about. First, the marriage of aircraft safety technologies and training is what enhances pilot safety. It's not one or the other, it's both. The marriage of technology and training. As you can see behind me, and we talked about just a moment ago, the technologies are on the airplane, so many of them have been impactful to improving the safety record. We put that into practice in the design of the Vision Jet with all of the things we just talked about in the SR to make more safety technology available to the pilot. FADA controls, touch screen, a clean and unintimidating instrument panel. Went beyond that, a stick pusher and stick shaker, auto throttle, stall prevention. And of course, I just talked about safe return. Amazing technology on the airplane, always acting in the background, regardless, if you will, of all the things the pilot is doing. But even with all the safety technology on board, that's not enough. There was a very real learning opportunity at Cirrus early on with CAPS being on the airplane. For a time, we were perhaps not realizing that we could improve the safety record even more by combining teaching and learning with the CAPS technology itself. Because the reality was, when CAPS was introduced to pilots in the SR, our safety record did not improve as much as we thought it should. Here was this airplane with this incredible new technology that in the worst case scenarios, a pilot could activate the parachute, but yet we weren't doing it enough. This incredible new opportunity was a chance to enhance safety, and we had a little bit of growing to do to marry that technology with the training. And in 2011, quite a time after the introduction, that's exactly what we did by introducing Cirrus Approach. Many components online, in person, with our training network, with our standardized instructor network, teaching people to fly and teaching people to use CAPS, when to use it, and how to use it. And indeed, from 2011 forward, we saw that accident record begin to improve after we combined those learnings. We went further with the program. Cirrus Embark, training pilots that by a pre-owned Cirrus that's new to them. We implemented even more of this thinking in our Part 142 full motion sim type rating program for the Vision Jet. And what happened in 2011, back to the SR, we saw the safety record improve. We finally were able to make the marriage work between the technology and how our pilots use it. And even today, as we think about our owners that live this thing called the Cirrus life, the fundamental part of the Cirrus life is not training as a simple event, but learning is a lifestyle. When you join the Cirrus life, you are committing to learn for a lifetime. It's one of the hallmarks of the program. And by doing that, you get the utility and the capability that Cirrus provides in this incredible airplane, and you do it safely. The key part of that Cirrus life is that commitment to a lifetime of learning. One simple principle is engagement drives learning, and we help our pilots stay engaged. The marriage of aircraft safety technology and flight training enhances pilot safety, pillar number one. The second pillar, the second main thought I'd like to leave you with, is that your safety management system components are always in place. The safety management system is a big word, right? Let me make it easier. And that is, make it easy every time. Make it routine and make it easy every time. And when we do that, we can count on better outcomes, and I'll reflect back on that in just a moment. Some of those safety system components include a robust partner network that's equipped to train to the factory flight instructor level, highly refined initial transition and recurrent programs, all the automation technologies that I just talked about now applied in the teaching environment, world-class online courses, for example, the ones we have in Cirrus Approach, Cirrus Embark, and the type rating program. Proactive, prepaid maintenance is even better. We call that program Jetstream. Many of you are familiar with the programs that you use, keeping your airplane well-maintained, on target, on time, all the time. And there are even larger corporate policies and procedures that can play a role that relate to single pilot operations. Let me give you a quick example. And that is the example of a pilot making the no-go decision for an important flight. How does the pilot do that comfortably in the environment that he or she is in within the enterprise? And I think there are two answers to that. Number one, that pilot has to be equipped and empowered to be the CEO of that flight. He or she is the decision maker and the highest level decision maker that day. And the second part that's just important, we have to celebrate that that pilot is empowered to make that sometimes challenging or pressure sensitive go, no-go call. Think about it for a moment. The benefit of completing a risky flight, even an unsafe flight, pales in comparison to the negative impact if there were an incident or accident on that same flight. Easily the best example at Cirrus Aircraft and in my flying and all corporate flying that we do at Cirrus Aircraft is what we call the Flight Operations Manual. I mentioned just a moment ago, make it easy, make it simple, and routine every time. I want to point out just one example of how we do that, because this Flight Operations Manual, this is the easy way to understand what proficiency looks like. And it's how we do it every time, or quoting from my friend Charlie Precourt, when we have these good and simple habit patterns, we create the bandwidth in our flying to deal with the unusual. And that's my Cirrus example. I'm asking you to use your examples. I know that CJP says that instead of standard operating procedures, guidelines of standard operating practices. Same thing. Make it easy and routine every time. An example that I'm referring to here is a matrix, a simple matrix before every time we fly. It's guidance for establishing personal weather minimums. Just a few moments can plug in your recent flying experience, when your last training event was, what the weather is in various places. In a very short period of time, establish are both the pilot and the machine prepared to complete the mission today. With that, let me transition to the third and final pillar, and I think the most important. And that's the role that culture plays in the safety of your flight operations organization. Culture and the personalities of the individuals that make up the culture in your flight operations organization. That is nothing less than the glue that ties the aircraft technology and the training together. And the hallmarks of that culture are questioning if our flight operations culture is healthy, never being satisfied, there's no such thing as good enough, committing to a lifestyle and a lifetime of learning, not seeing learning as an event, not settling for just the once a year 6158 ride, but committing to so much more on an ongoing basis. Some of the outwardly visible pieces of that culture at Cirrus are the Vision Pilots and Owners community. The Vision Pilots and Owners community engages, is actively communicating, sharing online and sharing in person, sharing through symposia and events and education and learning. Within VPO, standardization is the product of knowledge that VPO helps us understand how our pilots are flying so we can develop the tools and resources that they need to be as safe as possible. Perfect example of a culture that's engaged in flight operations for the Vision Jet. With VPO, we are building a culture of continuous improvement in the left seat. This third pillar of culture is the most important one of the three I've mentioned today, and candidly, it's very personal to me. And the most important component of culture is the component of sharing within the community. And I appreciate that I'm really talking through the lens of a little bit of the Vision Jet, single pilot operations through NBAA, but that applies to really every single thing we do at Cirrus. And as Julie said, whether it's I learned about flying from that or how we choose to share, it's not just about that community. I was just at our latest VPO, we call it Converge in Tucson. It's about 6 weeks ago. And there was a moment at the end of that first day when we brought up this concept, and we asked, after setting up exactly that, folks to share. There was a long period of silence, quite frankly, and I think everybody's trying to figure out what they were going to do there. But slowly but surely, 120 pilots were there. There are about 70 aircraft there. So, upwards of 25% of the fleet began to share experiences, just like Julie was talking about a moment ago, and they're flying the Vision Jet. That is the highest form, that culture of a safety culture. Again, you don't have to use the fancy words like SMS. Of that safety culture, we can share and learn from our shared experience. Backing up one, you saw the middle one, I mentioned safety management system. Just think of that as making it easy. And I'm going to show you again, even in my own experience, you saw it there. I always fly with the flight operations manual. It is on the iPad. And we always do a quick version of, let's look through that matrix to see what's going on today. How bad is that line of storms between here and my getting home in Knoxville tonight? I'll take a close look at that before I go. Looks like the convection's already moved off to the right. We're all weather people, right? Exactly all of those things. What is your recency? What is your total time? What is your experience in IFR? What are the minimums where you might have to go? What if I need to put it down before I get to where I'm going? What are the weather at the airports along the way? All of those can be done quickly. What you're trying to do, make that routine and make it the same way every time. Then we've already talked a little about the marriage of training and technology. We talked about Approach. We talked about Embark. We really think of our flight training in those simple terms. So with that, I'll pivot to a shared experience, and I may have the best one of all. I don't mind sharing what I'm about to, and I suspect most people in the audience already know, because it was 3.5 years ago, that I was in a very, very bad airplane accident. I was a pilot at command in Idaho, and as my friend Richard is sitting here on the front row, his eyes just staring right through me the entire time, I was glad to share the story of that to him about 6 or 7 months after it happened. And I forget, I stopped counting when it was several 100,000 views on AOPA and ASI. So I bet you already know some about it. So again, it's a bit unvarnished and unfiltered. I don't have a problem sharing it. And if I can help, that's why I do it. A little bit, though, about, all right, Todd, well, who were you before all this sort of happens? And so to step back just a little bit, I've already said I'm the luckiest guy in this room for a whole bunch of reasons, but I'm lucky to be the grandson of, or let me back up, before I get to my grandparents. What has that got to do with anything? I remember I moved this slide. A couple of different times when I've given this presentation to a few groups, I've struggled with, what do I name this thing? Well, it turns out that picture is actually from EMS, as when Life Flight got to me and sort of they began to take you apart and they're do the thing they do, they had that was on my person. And it turns out that just a few days before, I had grabbed this lip balm, and I always had a separate one for the last 30 years of my life. And so as it turns out, I said, am I going to name this? I learned about flying from that, or normalization of deviance, or all these other things, aftermath. No, I still carry that in my pocket today. I'm the luckiest bastard you know. It was with me that day, and it's still with me in my pocket, and you're going to see why in just a moment. Back to my background and where I come from. I'm lucky to be the grandson of a guy named Oliver Walton Simmons. It was a B-26 pilot. That's him when he was, gosh, I hope he's 20 or 21 right there at Maxwell. That was the Army Air Corps base in Alabama, right? That was before the Air Force. And on the right there is my mother's father. His name is Barney, and a crop duster. So three generations down, I had pilots in my family, and I've been so lucky and so blessed, and flying's been a part of my life almost the entire time. Early on, it was a Champ. You'll see a couple of them here. The family, the things we do as a family, and the way that we get to experience aviation, that's my son at a very young age, and the PA-11, more recently in the Super Cub, and then taking trips with the family or flying in the Super Cub. Not as many pictures here. That's in the Vision Jet, that one right there. And then the benefit we have to live this flying life is truly a blessing. It's been a part of generations of my family. And I think as we see here, that's the best I can say it. Actually, my son there is at Georgia Tech right now, so that explains the shirts. and we're standing there in front of the Wright Flyer. And to say that I feel blessed that flying is a part of my life is an understatement. It has been for generations, and on it continues. If we look at the kind of flying I was doing, not just in June of 2018, I shared with some my role prior to being at Cirrus. I was at Cub Crafters for about 3.5 years, and even prior to that, some of the airplanes that you saw have been flying in the backcountry for quite some time. Here are pictures of why do we do that? And the answer is because our airplanes can take us to places that only our airplanes can take us. I'm lucky to be with a colleague. Pete Bunce is in the back there. We are both directors for the RAF, the Recreational Aviation Foundation. And indeed, our mission is to maintain and create and protect access to the places that only some of these airplanes can go. These are some strips in Idaho. I think that may be Sulphur Creek. That first one is a picture of Mile High. You can take off the roads in some places, so I'm not going to dwell on that one. I don't remember if that's Root Ranch or Minham Lodge, where we were. No, I take that back. That's the other side of Johnson Creek, out in Idaho. My brother and I are quite close. My brother's a Cub driver, and he is an avid fly fisherman, and he and I spend time together. Again, I know, Richard, you and he have done the same thing. You can find the places where only these airplanes can take you. And so our time together spending, in this case, the Idaho backcountry, I think Dave Hirschman was here. Believe it or not, I think Dave is in that red airplane. I think he had come out in 16 or 17 was this picture, so I threw that one in there, of what we're doing in Idaho backcountry. That one may be the one at Minham in Oregon. And there again is my son in the Cub, about that same time frame. And that picture is actually from the trip, thank goodness, earlier in the trip of when I had the accident. And so a little bit about the accident itself. If you've seen the video, you know that this is in the Idaho backcountry, and just for perspective, there's McCall and there's Boise down there in the lower left. And what we're doing is, some may have done it as well. It's called the Big Creek Drainage. If you fly out there, you're going to be very familiar with all these strips. We were staying at Root Ranch. There it shows up in yellow. A ranch you can actually stay overnight in. And then we're going to go down to Cabin Creek. And so this is Thursday morning. I got out there the Sunday prior, and several days we've been flying. At the same time, we just the day before had gotten into the Idaho backcountry. I had been in Oregon prior, so keep that part in mind because some of the terrain and some of the difficulty is actually moving up, and I'll come back to that point. But our plan that morning is to get up in Root Ranch, go to Cabin Creek, and we're basically going to make a circle of what's called the Big Creek Drainage, if you know that. Soldier Bar, Bernard, Lower Loon, it sort of creates this circle. Johnson Creek is kind of on the left-hand side of where this picture is. And it's places you can go, and we're not necessarily tagging strips, only going to stop at a few. But as we get to Cabin Creek on this morning in June of 2018, the 21st, we made a decision for rather benign reasons to go back the other way to a strip called Dewey Moore. And it turns out that a good friend who's no longer with us, a dear, dear friend, Jim Richmond, he was going back to Yakima that day. And so for reasons that I look back on, reflect, were so important that I minimized that day, let's go to Dewey Moore. Now, Dewey Moore, if you know anything about it, is one of the more difficult strips. And as it turns out, I've not flown in there, even though I've flown into every other place, it seems like, in the Idaho backcountry. Whether it's Mile High or Simons or Vines or Soldier Bar or so many of those. But again, keep this part in mind, minimizing a little bit what we're going to do. So as you head to Dewey Moore, this is the stop in Cabin Creek, and that is the last photo on the ground of my airplane at the time, 1979 Papa. It's a wide-body Super Cub rebuilt by Cub Crafters, and a lot of mods on that airplane. I'm in the appropriate airplane for the backcountry, and I'll talk about planning and some of those aspects in just a moment. And here is Dewey Moore, and if you look close there, about a third of the way up the strip, that is my friend Jim. He's landed, and he's actually come to basically a stop. Yes, 750 feet seems like a short strip. Yes, the upward terrain, but the reality of flying, don't necessarily put everything you're thinking about those distances or the difficulty. I'm going to talk about in a minute the decisions that I made that resulted in the accident. And I think in this next picture here, you can see he's having to taxi with power up the strip. If you look closely there, what do you see at the top of the strip and every way around that? A lot of rising terrain. Keep that in the back of your mind. And not just rising terrain mountains. So back to the left in this picture is the drainage of the creek you can't see. You can see it in the first picture. And here is a picture of actually from my brother's airplane. Jim's on the ground, and I'm actually flying over to take a look. This is not a go-around. They're actually going to go back down the river to come into the strip, and I'm number 3 in this particular picture. At that point, without, if you happen to take a look at the AOPA video, you can do a little more on the detail. I make a decision to go around and full power and 90-degree left turn. So I'm flying down the drainage. As you turn in to Dewey Moore, that is a no return, no go around, but you are committed to landing then. I'm slightly left of what we otherwise might think of as a center line, and I see that I'm not lined up. I'm actually not too high or not necessarily going too fast, and again, because the people on the ground looking, and they hear me apply full power 90-degree left turn. At that point, that rising terrain I just talked to you about, and I'm in between, if you remember the visual image a moment ago of turning left or right, and there's not very much room, 60-degree bank, and that leads to a stall spin from somewhere between 150 and 250 feet. And we're at 5,000 feet. It's actually earlier in the day, so all of you know how this math works. Probably about 75% power, which is about right. Let's just give me the benefit of the doubt that I'm in a coordinated turn. You know that load factor increases. You're going up to 2 Gs at that point at 60 degrees. You've increased your stall speed to 140%. Normal is 50. That means my stall speed is up to about 70 now. That angle attack is true if you're about to stall. That's going to be applying to your propeller as well. At 75% power, you're at full power. You're probably also at full flap, so you're pretty dirty behind the power curve. All that means that left turning tendency is about as strong as it can possibly be. And if that left wing quits flying, introduce a yawing moment, you know what happens next, and that is what happens next. If you just consider for a moment that my 60-degree turn, like I said, is coordinated, I'm at 2 Gs, you immediately unload 2 Gs. So a 2,000-pound airplane was a 4,000 airplane that becomes unloaded. You're suddenly dealing with 2 tons of load, and you're effectively not flying. I'm describing for you what we all practice in a rather benign way in stalls. Some of us did spin training, and I did. Some of us not, but not in that environment, of course. We do them up high where we're safe. That 60-degree bank becomes a 90-degree bank. The left wing quits flying, and that results in the impact with the ground here. And so you're right. When you first look at these pictures, I only show them, I don't mind sharing them with you, that it's a reliably fatal accident. It turns out that I was lucky enough not to hit the ground at either straight down, that is a fatality, or flat. That oftentimes is. In fact, there are some other airplanes where the spar is sitting under your seat, and that's a really bad thing if you do that. Well, it turns out I hit at more or less an angle, and there's some things that help me in terms of really big tires. The wingtip actually touched. In fact, there's a funny story here. It's crazy. My brother and Jim went back to a couple of days after to gather some things, and I'll get to, I was life flighted out, etc. And they could see the scar along the hill where my wingtip had impacted at the first sign of impact. And as they looked around, right at that point was a dead snake. You think I was unlucky? How about that snake being right there where my wingtip hits, and he met his end, and luckily I didn't meet mine. And so when you see some of these pictures, you see that that's a pretty tough place to be in. Thank God for 26G seats, inertia reels. There is an SEC for airbags that I wish I'd had in the airplane, and my new airplane I do. I'll come to that in a minute. There were severed fuel lines. The good news was the fuel tanks above weren't severed. Contrast that, for example, to a Cirrus. There's no fuel tanks. It's a wet wing. So if the wing is violated or compromised, you've got fuel vapor. In my case, the tanks weren't necessarily, but there were broken fuel lines, and it's that vapor looking for an ignition source, and there's a bunch of them around. And again, lucky is an understatement that we did not have a fire when we got there, but surviving that is like I said, that's why I'm the luckiest person here. Since we're after lunch, I'll tell you a little bit about sort of what happened next. By the way, look really hard right here. That is my airplane on the ground. If you didn't know what you were looking for, you'd say, hey, there's an airplane sort of parked there, and that was the impact. And I think even recently, the Google Earth image, I think Dewey Moore still had it on there. So, you know, they take those shots every now and then. So for quite some time, I did not make any friends with the Forest Service. Luckily enough, they were able to help me and getting the airplane out. And in the ultimate irony, I think a 206 with 2 or 3 guys on board landed there, take it apart, and pulled it out with a helicopter. And so that happened a little bit later. But you can see the airstrip itself more or less at the top of the screen there. My path is like this, and they come back and they end up down here. Turns out that my not being in the river, another lucky break. If I'm there, I'm not here talking to you. But that's really loud. And so one of the things that, if we want to talk about in a different discussion, survival gear, is keeping a whistle on your person. How do you let somebody know where you are when it's loud all around you? I'm also going to talk about in-reaches in a moment and the fact that how that saved my life. Again, that's a picture after the fact, a couple of days later, from the same airplane. There we go. Should have just done that. Back to the accident itself, be a little bit unvarnished. My injuries were bad. It turns out that I'll show you a few of them, but not all of them. Had to be life flighted out, and this is the important part of having in-reach with you. This is a place where I've been lucky enough to be part of a group at the RAF and others that have got more folks flying in any scenario, quite frankly. You can come down under a parachute on the Cirrus in the mountains in Colorado, and having an in-reach on hand is not a bad idea. Yes, we have 406 ELTs these days, but we activated in-reach. The helicopter, ironically enough, newly retrofitted with Garvin avionics. It had a little trouble finding us because in-reach sends out a message that someone transcribes to the people flying. They were looking for us a little bit further away, and to our surprise, we were saying, we, the people helping me, I wasn't, come to Dewey Moore. And they go, we don't know where Dewey Moore is. So there's a whole bunch of things about flying in the backcountry versus how they usually pick folks up, perhaps near highways and things like that. But the great people of Life Flight, they took me first to McCall. I was in neuro-intensive care for about 2.5 weeks. You don't see it there, but a lot of broken bones in my face. I'll tell you about the facial injuries in a moment. And glad we had lunch. That's bad fractures. That's my right leg in the accident. I'm much, much better today. That does remind me the spiral fractures of the tibia. If you know the story of Alex Smith, watch that story on 30 for 30 or the ESPN. He had the same injury I did, and unfortunately for him, infection became a part of it. And an even funnier part more recently, have a mutual friend that knows Tiger Woods, and literally after Tiger's unfortunate accident, he called me and said, hey, send Tiger your stuff. And I'm like, Tiger didn't need my stuff. But it turns out Tiger Woods had very similar injury. When I saw him walking around the other day with someone on the course, I saw a limp that I recognized. But anyway, I was enamored with the quality of the machining of these parts they were putting me back together with because I'm an airplane guy. In fact, I went even further with my team as time went on, and I began to heal, and I said, hey, look, I've got titanium. In fact, let me show what I mean by that. That's my right leg. After the accident, it looks like the Eiffel Tower. Those are all titanium screws, and that's my left knee. So I show these to you, not to give you the medical pictures of the day, to say the significance of the accident and the parts in me. But back to the story, as I went on, whether it's carbon fiber in parts of my face, that's the lacerations I didn't show you, or titanium, or there was some Kevlar in something. As I like to tell my team, be really committed. Don't be one with the airplane. Actually become the airplane. I'm doing it. So, show some commitment. Let's talk just a little bit about, in the time remaining here, the most important part. Not a little bit, the most important part. Who knows about the science of normalization of deviance? Show of hands. Not enough or not going up. This is important. It's important the way we think about applying it to flying. When pilots deviate from standard operating procedures, I'm reading here so often, that non-standard behavior becomes the new norm. So what was unacceptable risk, we gradually move across and move again, and now that becomes acceptable risk. We have normalized that deviation. And through that normalization of deviance, we create risk, but we come to see that as the assumed normal risk. Julie and I were talking about this just a moment ago before she came up, this notion of risk in flying. Normalization of deviance is important. There's some big examples out there, right? Here's one of the best ones. It's too cold to go flying. Clearly outside launch parameters. Over time, what does Morton Thiokol do? Institutionalize normalization of deviance. hey, we're going to move here, and it worked that time, and we can go a little bit further. And that morning of the Challenger flight, we know what happened. We saw evidence right here. It's too cold. The O-rings are frozen. The reality of the really bad part is when the shuttle hit that wind shear and flexed that tank, is it 5,000 degree gases came out? An entire organization normalized that deviance, and unfortunately, we know the outcome. Here's the remarkable part of that. They turned around and did it again. Again. Institutionalized. Wait, how many of these tiles can come off? Not this many. You know what? It's going to be okay. And sure enough, that applies to our flying. Costa Concordia, anybody remember this one? Going to the shore is no big deal. We do it all the time. Except in that one. I forget how many billions of dollars and actually lives were lost in this one. And then there's one for flying that happened at about the same time frame. Anybody knows whose airplane that is? That's Dale Earnhardt's airplane near where I live in Knoxville, Elizabethton, Tennessee. Elizabethton's a little bit of a back door, right? If you're going to be racing in Bristol, you're a NASCAR person. Hottest day of the year. They just fueled up completely in Charlotte. The book says you can make it, but there is not much extra room in landing at Elizabethton in a Sovereign that's full. They hit hard. They hit so hard, as you know, the gear failed. And quite frankly, they're quite lucky. You know what? We've done it a bunch of times. We'll make that be okay today. We've left ourselves very, very little room. There's one more that I bet we all do, maybe almost every day in this room. It's a bad one, but we do it. You might know what that is. Normalization of deviance in our daily behavior. Maybe none of us in this room do it, but I bet you do. Texting and driving. Texting and driving. We've made it okay. And when you're distracted like that, in the time to read one text, your eyes are off the road, you go the distance of a football field. So this is a big, big issue, and that's part of the main takeaway that I have for my accident in June of 2018. I had actually normalized some of the most challenging strips. I had normalized, and I've been flying in the backcountry for 20 years. I've used phrases like I'm wearing the airplane. I'm so comfortable as to be complacent, not recognizing the risk. And I even talked about it with Jim on the radio. Have you been in here before? I said no. And Jim actually said a few more things. I had every opportunity to rethink the planning I was doing, but I'm moving beyond that. I have normalized. I fly in the backcountry. I've got the right airplane. This is going to be like the other thousands of times we've done exactly this. There were some good parts about the planning, our preparation, our emergency planning for weather, fuel. We had actually taken some things out of the airplane. We actually had a meeting that morning. Who has what emergency gear? Which of us has inReaches? And we all do. We wear them on our person, right? Anything you don't have on your person, you might not be able to get to. If my plane is on fire, in fact, going back to that was a funny story my brother had. As he gets to me, so he finally finds me back at the accident site. And remember, he lands, but he sees this happen. And unfortunately, they saw, but I don't remember the accident. I still don't. The first thing I remember is actually in the hospital several days later. And maybe that's actually, I'm lucky that I don't remember it all. But that being said, he figures I'm in the river. They can't actually find me. So things are bigger and more complicated. That's back to the whistle idea. Wouldn't have mattered if I had had one, I couldn't have blown it. As he gets to me, you saw what's there. He sees the fuel vapor everywhere, and he's sort of making this debate about, well, what am I going to do that I finally found him? He's yelling at the top of his lungs for Jim, another friend of mine that had been flying with Andrew, to come over. And he's yelling at the top of his lungs. He can't get them. They finally find him. But before all that, he says, look, if I don't grab Todd out, I'm debating whether or not is he paralyzed. I'm going to hurt him worse. But if this thing catches on fire, he burns up either way. Svelte I am not. I get that. So he grabs me and pulls me out. And as he's screaming and cussing at me for doing this to start with, he actually made the right decision. Luckily enough, I didn't have a back injury. And when I say lucky, that I'm not burned, that I'm not paralyzed, that I'm not amputated. So many things that could have happened, honestly, should have happened, did not. But back to the planning component, good planning on some components in terms of weather, density, altitude, emergency, the way that we're flying. Quite frankly, very poor planning on my part of not accessing or availing myself to more information that would have made a different decision. Second thing, and there's just three, is experience. And I'm a 3,000-hour pilot, a little over 3,000. 1,200-ish in the Super Cub, about the same in the SR, and the rest of that's in a Vision Jet. That's not exactly right, but that's pretty close. A lot of time in that one Super Cub is 1,000, over 1,000 hours, whatever it may be. The problem with that is that creates that complacency. In this case, that a lot of that is not recent experience. That week I had gotten there was the first time I'm out there flying at that time. And so that experience is, okay, a lot of experience, a lot of SR and Cirrus experience, but at the same time, what is your recent experience in the airplane? There's even another component to that. My personality has served me well in lots of parts of my life, whether it's academically or in my work, but even a little bit of the exuberance. This is living in Knoxville. We're out here for these couple of weeks in the summer. This is the fun time that we're having. You've got to actively guard against that and saying, is any of that getting in the way of good decision making? So the concept of experience, recent experience, and total experience. And again, I'm going to reflect back on the tool we have at Cirrus that walks us through that and makes it easy every time. And finally, this notion of excellence in airmanship. Maybe the most important that captures it all. I'm lucky to be a type-rated Vision Jet pilot, and I say that meaning the requirements of a type rating in a Part 61 enforces that we maintain our currency and maintain our proficiency. I almost like to think of that a different way, and that is, if you're willing to live and exercise the privileges of your airmanship in a type-rated environment there, why weren't you doing that here? I flew a Vision Jet down here and I'm type-rated exercising all of those things in that environment, yet somehow I'm lowering my own standards and not exercising my Super Cub type rating in an environment where the margins are much, much smaller. As I like to say, if I look on that chart of green circle, blue square, or black diamond, when you figure which pilot are you, the way that works in a Cirrus is, depending on where you are and your recent experience and your total time and your qualification, that might change the minimums, that might change the kind of weather you fly in, that might change whether you're flying at day or night, all of those things. I was either a green circle or a blue square flying into a black diamond strip called doing more. I could have easily told myself that by exercising a diligence that I didn't exercise, excellence in airmanship. This is something that, I see some people taking some notes. This is something that I think Richard knows about this, sort of created because someone told me something and I just felt like it applied to this accident. So take it for what it's worth. I was flying with a CFI, and we have 6-month recurrence. The type rating 5158s every year, and we intersperse 6 months of SR recurrence. We have a higher standard at Cirrus. And I forget, this was a couple years back, but he and I got to talking about his background, and he is a whitewater raft instructor on the Chattooga, up there not so far from where we are in Knoxville. And he was telling me about, he sees people come into that, and he sees this sort of continuum of being super cautious and conservative, and gradually moving down through getting more proficient, more experienced, and more confident, and then he sees them tip past something. And I heard that at the time, and I kept revisiting in my mind going, Todd, that's you. Maybe it applies to any scenario of something that we learn or we exercise. And so there's that first one, you start a new activity, something like flying, you're cautious. And you should be. That's a good thing. We're trying to learn what to do. And then as we gain some experience, we get a little more conservative in what we do, but we've moved off that first piece. Then we get more comfortable in what we're doing, the third C. Get comfortable in the airplane, comfortable in the environment. You have to really be diligent right in here though, right? The 100 to 200 hour pilots where that comfort can kind of take over. But then you get to where you want to be. You become confident, but not more than that in what you're doing. You trip past that, like I did in June of 2018, you get complacent, or God forbid, you get cocky. If you do those things, you might find yourself skipping steps. This is Todd's made up 6 C's. Try to live about where that arrow is, and maybe think about, because I'm not sure I like being at the top of that list. I'm sure I don't like being at the bottom of that list. But finding that place and making sure that your behaviors doesn't move you, especially into that second one from the bottom, the complacency, it's where you're not exercising that commitment to excellence in airmanship. I mentioned just a moment ago, how does all this apply to Cirrus Aircraft? And the answer is, every single time I fly, I'm using the FOM. We have a simple matrix that says, how are you flying today and what are you doing? And so this was back to that second pillar that we mentioned, and Charlie Precourt and I had this great conversation. Charlie's the director of flight safety at CJP. And this is the one where you utilize this every time. You make it easy to walk through. We all have our own versions of this, and I encourage you to use them as early, as much, and as often as you can. This is what we teach at Cirrus. The same is true for you. This story has a good ending. My son, who is the fourth generation pilot, he actually flew about 6 months after. And if you look in the lower right-hand corner, I still have a boot on my leg the day he soloed. And I'm glad to say that he's a private pilot now, and 6 months after that, I flew too. So I got back in the airplane, and people had asked me, God, are you going to fly again? I said, what do you mean? Flying's not what I do, it's who I am. I don't know any other way. And so not only am I flying a Cirrus again, I've probably flown about, on average, 400 to 500 hours, actually, in the past 2.5 years since the accident. And the answer is yes, I fly a Cub again, too, in the backcountry. Of course I do. But I do it in a way, safety and proficiency, and all I think about. And so all I can say is that I'm more than willing to share the story. I'm more than willing to tell it in as much detail as you want. But I know it can help. I know that as part of our effort, I know 450 people have Garmin inReaches now, so in case they get to that place, they can hit that button. I know of 2 people that have pulled a parachute in a Cirrus, and they both told me privately, Todd, I thought about what you said. One was in Aspen. It's very well known. He's in a ravine, and it's not going to work out. I know it can make a difference if we share and we anchor on that third pillar of sharing of culture, of culture and of shared experience. I encourage all you to find the way to do the same thing. I'll just close by saying, like I said, I'm the luckiest guy here, and I'm quite privileged and quite fortunate to be part of an aviation family like what's in here. Thank you for your time today. I appreciate it.